Hey guys, welcome back to the Useless Historian. You'd think the scariest thing a caveman ever saw was a predator in the dark, but it wasn't. Not even close. What truly kept them awake were the things that didn't make sense. A shadow that moved on its own. A stone that hummed before rain. A presence, watching, older than the earth itself. These weren't fears they painted on walls, they were the quiet ones. The ones they only whispered about when the fire burned low. This is what cavemen actually feared more than wild beasts. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, let's begin. The shadows that danced when no one moved. They never called them shadows. Back then, there were no words for things that didn't make sense. If something frightened you, you didn't describe it. You avoided it. If something followed you, you walked faster and pretended you hadn't noticed. If something moved in the corner of your vision, you stared at the fire and hoped it would pass. No one taught this. No elder told stories of what to fear or how to act. It was simply known, like hunger or warmth, or the way the sky changed color before rain. Somewhere deep inside, the people understood that some parts of the world were not meant to be looked at for too long. The shadows were one of those things. They didn't come every night. Sometimes weeks would pass without them. But everyone noticed when they returned, though no one said a word. There'd be a moment when someone turned their head and paused, just for a second, as if they'd forgotten something. The others would feel it too, though they wouldn't ask. The fire would be fed a little more often. Sleeping mats would be pulled closer together, and no one, not even the brave ones, would go to the edge of the light without a reason. That night was one of those nights. The fire had burned low, its orange glow flickering softly against the walls of the cave. Everyone had settled into that quiet rhythm. The silence that came after the stories had ended, but before the dreams began. The children were asleep, curled into bundles. The elders breathed slow and steady. The hunters, who always sat nearest the fire, stared into the flames like they were waiting for something to speak. And that's when it happened. The shadows moved. Not flickered, not shifted. They moved, smooth and certain, like a hand brushing across the wall. One of the men turned his head. Slowly. His eyes didn't widen, and he didn't speak. But his breathing changed, just slightly. He looked away a moment later, choosing instead to stare into the fire as if nothing had happened. But he had seen it, and so had others. A shape not shaped like a person, not shaped like an animal. It had no form worth naming, just motion. It stretched and curled where the light shouldn't reach, slithering up stone, around bones, behind piles of wood. It made no noise, and yet the air seemed to feel heavier when it passed. Some said it was the cave itself, remembering something. Others believed the shadows only came when someone had lied, that they were drawn not to flesh or food, but to falsehood, that they circled the tribe not to attack, but to watch and to listen, for the things that were never meant to be spoken aloud. One of the elders, a woman with a voice like cracked bark, had once whispered a story to a child too young to remember. She said the shadows were pieces of time that had fallen out of order, leftover moments, wandering in the dark, looking for the place they once belonged. And sometimes they found people warm enough and frightened enough to settle beside. She died not long after. No one repeated that story, and yet the idea remained. Not as belief, but as a shape in the silence. A shape you couldn't name, but that you felt when your back was to the fire and you didn't dare look behind you. That night, the fire cracked suddenly, a sharp pop of sap inside the wood. Everyone jumped, just slightly. Even the ones pretending to sleep. One of the mothers pulled her child closer, resting a hand on his back. A man reached for his spear, not to use it, but just to hold. Something about contact, even with stone, made the world feel less brittle. Someone had carved something on the wall near the entrance, a line of curved scratches, like ripples or waves, or perhaps eyes. No one claimed them, they hadn't been there the morning before. The shadows paused near them, they didn't stop, not entirely, but they hovered, like they were remembering the hand that made those marks. The fire flickered lower, and for a brief moment, it looked like the wall was breathing. Then nothing, just firelight again, just sleeping bodies. Just the sound of wind outside, and the soft hush of night. And yet, no one slept. They lay still, of course, as they could. Eyes closed, breathing calm. But no one slipped into dream, not while the shadows were moving. Not while the fire still had fuel, not while the air tasted like old stone and older stories. And eventually the fire began to burn higher. Someone had added a branch when no one was looking. And slowly as the hours passed, the shadows thinned, stretched, and faded back into place, as if they had never been there. By morning the cave was filled with smoke and dew. A bird chirped faintly from the cliffs above. One of the hunters stood and stretched. No one mentioned the night. No one asked about the carvings on the wall. No one talked about what they didn't see, because fear in those days wasn't something you spoke. It was something you shared, by saying nothing at all. Why the fire sometimes refused to speak. There were nights when the fire simply didn't answer. It burned. Yes. The flames rose, the wood cracked, the smoke curled into the air, but it was quiet in the wrong way. Not silent like peace, but still like absence. As if the fire wasn't really there at all, as if it was only pretending, like a mouth that had forgotten how to make sound. The people noticed it right away, even the youngest among them, those who hadn't yet learned which berries to avoid or which stones made sparks. Even they could feel when the fire had gone strange. It wasn't the cold. Not really. They could handle cold. Cold had rules. Cold meant adding furs, pulling close, breathing deep. But when the fire changed, the rules vanished. Warmth stayed, but comfort left. The light was still there, but it didn't reach. And no matter how high the flames went, the darkness around them never stepped back. They would sit in a circle, as always, backs to the cave wall, feet to the glow, eyes half lowered, and wait for someone to laugh, for a child to yawn, for an elder to hum, or start a story. But nothing would come, because the fire wasn't listening. And when the fire didn't listen, the people didn't speak. There was a boy, not yet old enough to join the hunts, but tall enough to carry water, who once asked, in a whisper, if the fire was angry. One of the women near him, his aunt, or maybe not his aunt, gently pressed her finger to his lips. She didn't explain. She just looked at the flames, then closed her eyes. You never talked about a silent fire while it was watching you, because that's what it felt like the fire was watching, not glowing, not warming, not flickering or dancing, just watching. A narrow, ancient stare that came from deep inside the coals, the kind of look you give something you're trying to remember, or trying to forget. There were stories, of course, but no one told them during those nights. Only later, when the fire had returned to itself, when the sparks leapt and the smoke curled like fingers around old memories, only then did the elders speak of the fire's silence. One story said the fire remembered the first death. That long ago, before even the mountains had names, there was a child who wandered too far. The tribe had no fire then, only embers in the sky, only stars and breath and frost. The child fell, and no one found him. When they finally did, he was already gone, but the ground where he had lain was warm, a strange warmth, dry and pulsing, as though something had burned below the earth. They gathered around that place, dug into it, and there, in the soil, the first fire came up like breath. And so, some said, the fire was born from death. And on certain nights, when the air was too still, and the bones too quiet, it remembered, it grieved, and it refused to speak. Another story told of a different fire, not one that warmed, but one that listened. A listening fire was a dangerous thing. It didn't ask questions, and it didn't give comfort. It only gathered words, stored them, saved them, and when it had heard too much, it would grow quiet, not to rest, but to choose what to remember, and what to burn. That's why people were careful with what they said near the fire. Jokes were fine, short stories, warnings, recipes, even dreams, but never secrets, never names of the dead, never thoughts you didn't want followed. Because if the fire heard too much, it might fall silent, and if it fell silent, it might begin to judge. And judged people sometimes vanished. Not in storms, not on hunts, not to beasts. They were just gone, their sleeping furs left undisturbed, their tools still set aside neatly, their footprints ending in soft ash near the edge of the fire ring. No one ever said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. The fire had taken them. That night, the flames burned low again, despite the dry wood, despite the bellows, despite the effort of two men crouched and blowing into the kindling with practiced care. It caught. Yes, it rose. But it didn't dance. It stood still and narrow, like a spine of orange light, rigid and listening. The cave was full. No one spoke, even the elder who usually told stories, the man with the hollow voice and the eyes that never closed fully, stayed quiet. He just stared into the flame, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on his knee. He wasn't afraid, exactly, but he was remembering something. Everyone could feel it. A girl stirred and reached for a bit of dried fruit from a woven pouch beside her. It crunched. The sound echoed. Too loud, too sharp. The fire hissed, and then, very slowly, dimmed. That was the moment they knew. The fire had turned inward again, gone somewhere far from the cave, somewhere before warmth, before speech. It would not speak tonight. And so they sat, for hours, wrapped in silence and in the not quite dark, trying not to think too loudly, because sometimes, if you thought too loudly, the fire would hear anyway, and it remembered things long after the people had forgotten. The path the hunters never took. There was a trail near the edge of the ridge, not far from the hunting paths, but not quite part of them either. You could see it from the higher stones, especially in the early morning, when the fog clung low and the leaves shivered even without wind. A narrow line of flattened grass, a few broken branches, the faint shape of footsteps long erased by time and weather. The strange thing wasn't that the path existed. Many paths did. People wandered. Animals passed through. The world was full of soft roads carved slowly by repetition. No, what made this one different was that no one ever walked it twice. Some didn't even walk it once. The hunters knew it was there. They had seen it many times, from a distance, and yet no one followed it, not all the way. They might step near it, check for tracks, sniff the wind, adjust their course, but never fully enter. The path had a quiet curve to it, bending toward the darker trees, where the canopy thickened and the light came through in strips instead of patches. No prey ever came from that direction, and no scent trails ever led there, which of course should have made it the perfect place to investigate. No predators, no competitors, no rival clans leaving marks or snares, but that was exactly why the hunters avoided it. It was too quiet, too untouched, too perfect. And when the world offers you a place that seems untouched by danger, the oldest part of your mind should ask why. One of the older hunters, a man with a long scar down his shoulder and a habit of chewing dried bark while he walked, once explained it like this. You know how you can smell when a beast has passed, the way the air holds the shape of something wild. That path, it smells like nothing, like a place that's never been breathed on. Another said it wasn't about scent, it was about sound, that when you stood near the trail, the birds didn't call, the insects didn't hum, even your own footsteps felt muffled, like the ground wasn't quite willing to carry the noise. The trees leaned a little wrong, the light didn't settle, it shimmered too much like water, like reflection. One evening, long ago, a young man named Eno took the path anyway. He was bold, too bold, perhaps proud of how far he could throw and how quietly he could move. He wasn't trying to prove anything, not really, he just wanted to see. To be the one who returned and said, "There's nothing there, just trees and shadows and stories made bigger by fear." He left at dusk, carrying only a spear and a thin wrap of smoked meat. The sun had nearly dipped below the hills, and the fire in the cave behind him had just begun to crackle. A few people saw him go. No one stopped him, but they didn't look away, either. He never came back. At first no one said anything. Maybe he'd gone further, tracked something deep into the woods. Maybe he'd doubled back along the river. Maybe he was hunting in silence. That first night, they waited. The second, they muttered. By the third, they knew. No one went to find him. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood. That was the price of that path. It didn't want to be walked, and if someone walked it, the path would take something in return. A few days later, something odd happened. A set of small stones appeared at the mouth of the path, arranged in a strange spiral. Not natural, not placed by wind or falling branches. Deliberate, meaningful. But whose meaning? No one in the tribe claimed them, and no one touched them. One of the children approached, just close enough to see. The spiral wasn't made of ordinary stones. They were teeth. Small, smooth, old, not animal. Human. The spiral was left undisturbed. Within a week, rain had come and washed the shape away, though the memory of it stayed. And after that, the hunters grew more cautious. The path wasn't just avoided, it was forgotten. At least aloud, but sometimes, when a hunt grew long and the prey was scarce, one of them would pause, look toward the far ridge, and squint. The trail was always still there, untouched, unused, but always there. Some wondered if it led to a place the world tried to forget, or a time that had never finished. Or maybe it wasn't a path at all, just a scar on the ground where something had once dragged itself through, slowly over days, and never looked back. There were stories, quiet ones, about lights seen flickering at the end of that trail. Not firelight, not stars, just pale, slow glows, moving too evenly, too gently, like breath through thick mist. And if you watched long enough, you could almost see figures moving, not walking, gliding, as if the path no longer touched the ground at all. No one went to see, not anymore, because the hunters had learned something their ancestors might have known too, that not all paths are made for walking. Some are made for warning, and when the trees bend inward, when the wind stands still, and when the air smells like nothing, that's not a path, that's a mouth, waiting to be fed. When the sky wouldn't answer back, they didn't pray to the sky, not in the way we think of prayer. There were no chants, no songs, no whispered invocations rising with the smoke, but they did speak to it, not always out loud, sometimes only with their eyes, sometimes only with the stillness of their bodies, the way a hunter would pause on a ridge and look upward before the first throw, or how a child would stare at the clouds and hold her breath, like she was listening for something just beyond the wind. The sky had always answered, not with words, never with words, but with signs, a certain shape in the clouds, a flicker of color before rain, the hush of birds before a storm. The people learned its moods. They learned to tell when it would smile, when it would weep, and when it would grow angry and throw fire at the trees. They learned that the sky had rhythms, that it changed not just from day to night, but from feeling to feeling. It was alive in its own way, and it noticed them. That was what made the silence so frightening, because one day the sky simply stopped. It happened in midsummer. The air had been heavy for days, not hot, not stormy, just pressed, like the world was holding its breath. The sky stayed blank and still, a flat sheet of dull white that neither moved nor deepened. No wind, no birds, no clouds, no response. A child tossed a pebble at a crow, and the crow didn't fly. It blinked and stared and stood still until the pebble bounced off its wing. Then it walked away, not into the air, but along the ground, as though it too had forgotten what the sky was for. That evening, the fire was restless. It hissed and swirled without smoke, its flames rising and falling in confused spirals. The tribe sat together as usual, but no stories were told. Everyone was listening, not to each other, but to the world outside, waiting, watching. One of the elders, an old woman who rarely spoke anymore, stood up slowly and walked to the mouth of the cave. She looked up, not to check the weather, but as if she expected something to be looking back, and nothing was. The sky didn't move, not even a breeze brushed her hair. She didn't speak, but her face shifted, and when she returned, she sat with her back to the entrance, something she'd never done before. Someone said, quietly, that the sky had turned its face away, that it had closed its eye. Another believed it was listening from behind a wall, that some invisible veil had fallen across it, that it wasn't angry, or sad, or lost, just distant, unreachable. And for those people who had always lived beneath the sky, who had drawn meaning from its colors, shaped their days by its breath, the silence was unbearable. Because silence, from something that once watched you, doesn't feel like peace. It feels like abandonment. The moon didn't rise that night. The stars did, barely, thin, pale pricks of light, half hidden and unsure of themselves. The hunters didn't sleep outside as they usually did. The cave was full, more crowded than it had been in many moons. Even the animals were uneasy. The dogs didn't howl, but they paced. The goats refused to settle. The small black bird that nested near the fire pit had vanished. Its feathers were found in the morning, stuck to the ceiling, where no hand had placed them. And still, no clouds, no light, no movement, just that endless lid of blank sky. It was the children who asked first. Where did the sky go? Did it leave? Is it broken? No one answered. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know. The elders who usually told long, layered stories from half-remembered dreams had nothing to say. There was no tale for this, no creature to blame, no lesson to be learned, because this wasn't a punishment, it wasn't a trick or a curse, it was something far worse. It was indifference, the sense that the world above no longer remembered them, or never had. One night, someone tried to shout, a sharp, high call into the darkness, aimed at the stars, not a cry for help, just a question, hurled upward, half in defiance, half in hope. It echoed back through the valley, untouched. No rustling in the leaves, no startled wings, no thunder, just quiet. On the sixth night, a young girl whispered to her brother that the sky had moved behind the earth, that it had crawled beneath the ground to sleep, and the longer it stayed there, the deeper it would dream, until maybe it forgot how to wake. That was when her mother placed a hand gently on her head and asked her not to speak of it again, not because it wasn't true, but because it might have been. Eventually, on the eighth morning, something changed. The clouds returned, thin at first, then swelling, curling, carrying the sound of distant water. The birds returned too, loud and clumsy, as if in apology for their absence, and the sky blinked, not with light, but with motion, a gentle shifting of color, of weight, of presence. It was back. The people didn't cheer, they didn't celebrate, they just sat, and breathed, and let the wind move through their hair without question. They didn't ask why it had gone, they didn't dare, because when something as vast and constant as the sky forgets to see you, even for a little while, you never fully trust it again. Not completely, you keep one eye on it, always, and you speak to it, softly, just in case it's still listening. What the elders saw but never named. They didn't have words for everything they knew. The elders held memories that had never been spoken aloud, not because they were sacred or secret, but because there were no sounds shaped to carry them. These weren't facts or instructions. They couldn't be passed like a flint blade or drawn like a mammoth on stone. These were memories made of sensation, of silence, of heat, of something watching. Not all of them shared what they'd seen. Some couldn't. Others wouldn't. There was a way their eyes shifted when they remembered. You could see it sometimes when a story would trail off halfway through, and the old one would pause, stare just past the firelight, and fall quiet. You could speak their name, you could offer food, but they wouldn't hear you, not for a moment. They were back inside something, and when they returned, they would always blink a little harder than necessary, like they were trying to leave something behind again. No one ever asked what they saw. It wasn't forbidden, it just wasn't wise. One elder, a man called Luro, whose face looked carved from driftwood, used to sit with his back to the wind. Always, no matter the season, no matter the direction, he would shift and shuffle and grumble, until he faced away from it. Someone once joked about it, lightly, and Luro didn't answer. He only looked toward the dark trees and muttered something too quiet to catch. After that, no one mentioned it again. Even the children learned to leave space at the back of the wind. There was a woman too, with only one working eye. The other had turned white years ago, but she never covered it. She said it still saw, just not the same things. She was the one who taught the youngest how to listen to silence. Not for danger, she said, but for difference. Silence is never empty, she would whisper. It always has shape. You have to feel around inside it. Sometimes the elders would gather before dawn, not for talk, just to sit. No fire, no food, just 4 or 5 of them, lined in a row near the mouth of the cave, facing the pale edge of sky, watching, waiting, listening. Not every day, not every moon, but always after something strange had happened, after a new shadow, a new birth, a sudden dream that passed through the whole camp like a chill. They never said why they sat together, but the others knew to give them room. There were things they saw, long ago or just last night, that they wouldn't put into words, not because they couldn't, but because words would shape the wrong thing, because naming something makes it stay, and these things, they weren't meant to stay. One elder had once drawn a symbol in the dirt, just 3 lines, like teeth, or a trap, or maybe the roots of something upside down. He stared at it for a long time, then wiped it away with the side of his foot, and stood without speaking. He wouldn't tell what it meant, wouldn't even look at the others. That night, the wind changed direction, and the fire refused to rise. Some of the younger ones whispered that he had called something forward by accident, but the elder only said, it was already coming. Not all of them were afraid. That's what made it worse. Some of the elders didn't fear what they'd seen. They respected it, or pitied it, or in rare moments, seemed to miss it. One woman used to hum a single note when she fell asleep, low and steady, like the vibration of a stone in deep water. She said she first heard it when she was a girl, lost in the hills for a night. The sound kept her warm, she said. Not her body, but her mind, like it held her together, while the world tried to forget her. She hummed that same note every night, until the day she died. After that, others in the tribe claimed to hear it sometimes, coming from the rocks at dawn, No one tried to follow it. There was always the sense that the elders weren't remembering the past. Not exactly. They were seeing something still happening, just out of view, something circling. And when their stories grew disjointed, or their eyes lost focus, it wasn't confusion. It was distance. They were looking at something we weren't allowed to, and maybe something that wasn't supposed to be looking back. That's why the children were taught to listen when the elders grew silent, not just to respect them, but to recognize that silence has weight, that sometimes what isn't said is louder than anything else, and that when the oldest among them went quiet, it didn't mean they had forgotten. It meant they remembered something too clearly, and the shape of it still hurt to hold. The time the wind came from the ground. It began with the dust, just a little at first, a faint stirring of soil beneath their feet, not enough to notice unless you were watching the ground closely, but one of the children did. He had a habit of lying on his belly near the entrance to the cave, nose nearly in the dirt, listening to ants and watching pebbles shift like stars in a slow sky. That day he blinked and frowned, because the pebbles weren't just shifting, they were trembling, not from footsteps, not from the wind. The trees were still. The air above was still, but the dust, it danced, he told his mother. She looked and saw nothing, brushed it off. But later that evening, someone else felt it too. A man returning from the river said the path felt wrong, like the ground wasn't holding him up quite right, not sinking, not shaking, just humming, a low, breathy pulse that came not through the ears, but through the soles of his feet. He took shorter steps without realizing it. His breath came quicker. When he reached the cave, he sat down hard and didn't speak for a while, and then, late that night, the wind came. But it didn't come from the hills, not from the sky, not from the trees, or the cold edge of mountain air. It came from below, a soft exhale, as if the earth itself had been holding in a secret and finally let it go. The fire bent backward, away from the hearth, toward the wall. Ash scattered across the stone floor, not outward, but inward, toward the center. The animals grew uneasy, shifting in place, their eyes wide and glassy. No howling, no barking, just stillness, and staring, and the smell, not sulfur, not rot, not anything sharp, just deepness, a scent without shape, like the inside of a closed fist, like forgotten breath, rising from an old grave. The people didn't speak of it that night. There was no panic, no questions, just a quiet tightening of space, bodies pulled closer, hands gently resting on shoulders, backs leaned against the cave wall, as if to anchor themselves. No one wanted to stand. It felt like standing might invite something. The wind continued. It didn't howl, it didn't gust, it just flowed, a thin ribbon of movement that hissed between stones and lifted strands of hair from sleeping brows. It carried no cold, but it chilled, because it wasn't supposed to be there. Wind belonged to the sky. It danced through trees and over rivers, not beneath feet. The old woman with the white eye woke first. She sat up, rubbed her hands together slowly, and said, very softly, "It's remembering again." No one asked what she meant. The fire cracked, and for a moment, the glow flickered in reverse, shadows leaning toward the flame instead of away. That's when they knew. This wasn't just wind, it was breath, something old and buried, not dead but resting, exhaling slowly from beneath the rock. There were stories half lost, barely whispered things, about breathing caves and sleeping grounds, about places where the earth once swallowed something too large to die, and too angry to fade. It had settled deep, far below, wrapped in roots and stone and time, and every few hundred moons, it remembered to breathe. A child asked the next morning, if the mountain had a mouth, if the rocks had lungs, if maybe the world was not solid, but soft and slow and dreaming. Her father told her to hush, but he didn't deny it, because in the early light, the ground was still warm, not from the fire, not from the sun, but from below, a soft heat, like hands pressed gently against the soles of their feet, not burning, not dangerous, just there. The plants near the edge of the cave had turned slightly, leaning toward the stones instead of the sky, and the dust still danced. That day, no one left the camp. The hunters stayed, the gatherers watched the ground. Even the birds seemed quieter, flying lower, wings stiff with uncertainty. By nightfall, the wind had stopped, gone as quietly as it came, but its memory lingered, not as sound or scent, but as a question: what breathes beneath us, when we've all gone still? The elders offered no stories that time, not even gestures or warnings, just silence. Because some fears don't come from what moves above us. Some fears rise, warm and wordless, from the earth itself, and when they do, all you can do is stay still and listen. When the cave echoed a voice that wasn't ours, caves were not just places to sleep, they were chosen. Not every hollow in the stone was fit for living. Some were too dry, some too wet, others had strange drafts, echoes that bent the sound in the wrong direction, or ceilings that made even a whisper feel like a scream. But when a cave felt right, it felt known, like it had been waiting for them, long before they arrived. The cave they lived in now had held them for many seasons. Its walls had seen stories, births, deaths, dreams, and silences too long for counting. It was a place of memory, of warmth, of shared breath, and that was why the voice was so wrong. It came on a still night, when the air hung heavy with mist. No wind, no fire. The embers glowed low and soft, barely enough to light the hands beside them. Most of the tribe was already lying down, arranged in a slow circle, heads turned toward the mouth of the cave, and backs tucked into hides and moss. Then, from somewhere deeper in the stone, came the voice. It didn't shout, it didn't whisper, it simply spoke. A single phrase, not in words anyone recognized, but it had the shape of speech, the rhythm of something said with purpose. The sound didn't bounce the way it should have. It didn't echo outward or roll through the chamber like thunder. It slid along the walls, as though it had been spoken inside the stone, as though the cave itself had opened a mouth to remember something out loud. Everyone froze. Not because of what was said, they didn't know the meaning, but because they knew it hadn't come from any of them. Every face was still, every mouth closed, every breath held. Not even the dogs stirred. It was as if the cave had paused time for a moment to speak on its own. A child began to cry, softly, and was quickly hushed by a hand and a heartbeat pressed gently to her back. No one told her not to be afraid, because everyone was. One of the older men stood slowly and looked deeper into the cave. Not far, just a few paces toward the dark. He didn't bring a torch, didn't light the branch he held. He just listened, and the cave stayed quiet, but not empty. There was a presence in the silence, not a body, not a shape. Just the feeling that somewhere beyond the edge of sight, someone had just finished speaking, and was waiting to hear if anyone would answer. No one did, because no one knew how. That voice had not been made for them. One of the elders, the same who always sat near the entrance and watched the sky in silence, said later that he had heard the voice once before, many seasons ago, when he was young and still afraid of sleeping alone. He had followed a wounded deer into a hollow and found a chamber so round, so smooth, it felt more like a bowl than a shelter. He sat there for a while, watching the light flicker on the damp stone, and then he heard it, the same cadence, the same weight, not loud, not cruel, but very, very old. He left without taking the deer, and he never returned to that hollow. He didn't tell anyone back then, because how do you say that stone had spoken? That silence had shape and sound, that something deep in the belly of the mountain had memory and breath, and maybe even regret. They had no word for echo back then, but they knew it when they heard it. They knew how a laugh returned to you with softness, or how a name called out in the dark came back with a kind of curve. But this voice didn't curve. It didn't return. It simply remained, as though the cave hadn't given it back, because it had never truly left. There were markings in one of the back chambers, faint lines, shallow, not quite carving, and not quite paint. Not like the animals and hunts they etched with care. These were different. Not symbols, not shapes, just scratches, circles and spirals, and something that looked almost like a jaw, half open. They hadn't been there before. No one had made them. No one ever claimed them. And yet, they always seemed fresh. Every time someone checked, the lines were just as sharp, as if the wall had drawn them again overnight. Eventually, the voice stopped. It never came back the same way, but now and then, on cold nights, when the mist hung low and the fire refused to rise, they thought they heard the breath of something speaking just under the sound of silence. Not words, but the idea of words, and the cave listened too. Because once it speaks, even once, you can never be sure it won't speak again. And if it does, you better hope it's not asking a question, because you might not want to know what it sounds like when a cave is disappointed. The circle of stones we weren't meant to find, they weren't looking for it. That's what made it worse. Because stumbling onto something that had waited patiently for no one, feels different than being led. and even now no one could say whether they had wandered off the trail or been gently pushed. It was late in the day, that brittle gold hour when the light turns soft and the air tastes like sleep. The hunters were heading back with little to show, no fresh blood, no new tracks, just the weight of long steps and empty hands. They were already thinking of the fire, the broth, the closeness of breath inside the cave. Then they saw the circle. At first it didn't even seem strange. Just a few upright stones, spaced out in a wide loop, taller than a man, smooth in some places, cracked in others. No markings, no paint, no offerings laid out before them. But something about their spacing, something about the way the grass stopped just short of touching them, made the men slow down. They stood still. The wind didn't blow, the light didn't move. One of them stepped forward, carefully, and placed a single toe inside the ring. Nothing happened. No noise, no shift in air, just the sudden sinking feeling that someone had opened their eyes behind him, wide and unblinking. He stepped back. They circled it slowly, saying nothing, trying not to name what it looked like. A meeting place, maybe, a trap, a grave. But none of those words quite fit. It was too quiet for reverence, too untouched for violence, and too intact for burial. It didn't feel like it belonged to anyone, which meant it had always been there, and someone or something had always been waiting for it to be found. One of the younger hunters tossed a stone into the center of the ring. It landed without sound. No bounce, no shift. Just landed and stayed, as if the ground beneath it had accepted it too quickly, as if it had been waiting for that stone too. They didn't speak of it when they returned. No one asked why they came back slower than usual, or why their eyes looked like they were still seeing something behind them. But the next morning, when the hunting party gathered again, none of those men stepped forward. They stayed behind, sharpened spears, tied cord, watched the sky. The others went on without them. Later, a story formed. No one knew who first told it, but it grew like moss, soft and slow, and hard to remove once it settled. It said that the circle of stones hadn't been built, not by hands, not even by time, that it had been placed, all at once, in silence, that it wasn't there until it was, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Children asked if it was a door. Some said yes, others said no, not a door, but an eye, not something you walk through, but something that watches when you walk too near, something that waits to be noticed, and then watches to see what you'll do with that knowing. One woman, older, rarely listened to but always watching, claimed it moved, not the stones, but the space between them, that every few seasons the shape of the ring changed, just slightly. The gap that once faced the sunrise now faced the river. The curve that once opened to the trees now pointed to the hills. Not enough to see it happening, just enough to notice too late. She said it was listening to the land, turning with it, and maybe it wasn't meant to be found at all. Not by them, she said. It wasn't waiting for us. We just got in the way. No one argued, because deep down every person who had stood near the circle knew the same quiet truth, that they were not meant to be there, not just uninvited, but unrecognized. The circle didn't react to them, didn't threaten, didn't welcome. It simply stood, stone after stone, old and exact and distant, like it was remembering something far older than fire, far older than fear. And every so often, when the mist was just right and the birds fell quiet, they thought they could see it again, between the trees, not closer, not further, just there. And the stones were always watching, not them, but something else, still coming. Why we slept facing the wall? It wasn't a rule. No one ever said it out loud, but night after night, when it came time to sleep, they all turned the same way, not toward the cave mouth, not toward the fire, but toward the wall, their backs to the open dark, their faces to the cold, curved stone. At first glance, it might have looked like caution, like a way of staying warm, of huddling in a shared direction to trap heat between shoulders. But that wasn't it, because even in the hottest months, when sweat pooled at their necks and the fire barely burned, they still slept facing inward. Even the children, even the dogs, especially the dogs, because no one wanted to see what might be standing at the edge of the light. They never talked about it during the day. They would laugh, cook, stretch, sharpen tools, and tell stories with their backs to the wall, open to the world. But as soon as the fire began to dim and the shadows stretched long across the cave floor, a quiet shift would take place. They would roll over, slowly, and face the stone. There was something safe in the stone, It didn't move, didn't flicker or change. It held warmth, it echoed gently, and most of all, it didn't look back, because the dark outside the cave sometimes did. One man, long ago, before most of them could remember, had tried something different. He claimed he was stronger than fear, that nothing waited outside but night and air. So he lay down near the fire, placed his back against the wall, and faced outward, toward the trees, toward the flickering black. He didn't make it to morning. The fire still burned, his skin still warm, but his eyes were wide and unmoving, and his mouth hung open like it had been trying to speak and never finished. No wound, no mark, no sound in the night, just a quiet unraveling. After that, no one tried again. An elder later said that there were things which came only when you looked for them. Not beasts, not spirits, but watchers, not because they meant to harm, but because they noticed, noticing. She said that the world had layers, and the dark was one of them. A skin stretched thin over something deeper, and if you stared into it long enough, you might not like what blinked from beneath. That's why the wall mattered. It had no eyes, no hidden thoughts. It gave back what you gave it, warmth for warmth, stillness for stillness. You could breathe beside it. You could whisper into it. You could dream without fear of what your face might reveal to the night. Some of the older ones would touch the wall as they fell asleep. Just a fingertip, just a palm, as if to remind themselves where they were and where they were not, because outside, things passed by. Not often, but sometimes. Once on a moonless night, a child woke too early and rolled over before the others. Her eyes hadn't adjusted yet. Everything was blur and breath and shadow. She looked toward the cave mouth, and someone was standing there. Not inside, not outside, just at the edge, still, watching, not breathing. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, didn't lean back. It just watched, and after a while, it was gone. The girl never cried, never told her parents, but she never faced outward again, even in the warmth of summer. Even when the fire burned high, she curled tight against the stone and whispered to it as she fell asleep. The wall, at least, never listened too closely. And that was a comfort, because sometimes, even silence feels like protection. Years later, someone carved faint marks into the back wall, a row of dots, a single curved line. No one claimed them, but they stayed, and over time people started sleeping near them, as if the markings offered something extra, a kind of seal, a quiet agreement. Here, the dark cannot reach you. Not all caves were like this. Some had no safe walls, no curve to hold your back, just open stone and colder air. Those caves were never home, not even for a night, because home to them meant more than fire or shelter. It meant sleeping in the one direction that kept your thoughts from drifting too far outward. The wall didn't answer questions, but it didn't ask any either, and when the wind howled or the fire crackled strange, it was the wall they turned to, not because they feared the dark, but because they knew, sometimes the dark wanted to be seen, and they'd learned the hard way not to look back. The first time we heard the moon weep. The moon had always been kind. They didn't have a name for it. Not exactly, but they had gestures, glances, small sounds they'd make in its presence. When it rose, they would pause. When it was full, they would linger longer outside the cave, warming their bones in its strange silver breath. It didn't give warmth the way fire did, or light the way the sun did, but it had something softer, something steady. It was the sky's quiet eye, the one that watched but didn't judge, and they trusted it. They believed in their wordless way that the moon watched over them, that it stayed awake while they slept, that it noticed when children were born and when elders passed. Some even whispered, on certain nights, that the moon followed them, that it moved a little differently when someone was in danger, as if trying to catch their attention without scaring them. But one night, the moon changed. It was high and bright, too bright, and hung strangely low, like it was leaning in to listen. The sky was clear, no clouds, no wind, just the cold breath of the dark and the glow of the world above. They had gathered outside the cave, not for a hunt, not for fire, but because the air felt strange, not dangerous, just wrong, and then they heard it. Not a howl, not thunder, not wind through the trees. It was a sound they didn't understand. Soft, rhythmic, not from the sky exactly, but near it, like something was pressed against the world just above them, sobbing without breath. The first to hear it was a girl no older than 6. She tugged her mother's arm and pointed upward, her mouth wide but silent. Her mother leaned down to listen, and her face changed, not with fear, but with recognition. like she had heard that sound before, long ago, in a place without words. Others heard it too. Men who'd never flinched at wolves, women who'd walked alone into forests full of eyes. Even the oldest ones, the ones who'd stopped believing in new things, stood still with their heads tilted just enough to catch the sound, and it was weeping. The moon was weeping. No one knew how they knew, but they did. The sound didn't echo from the trees or the ground. It didn't pass with the wind or swirl from caves. It came from above, soft and hollow and ancient. A sound of something watching and mourning. What it grieved for, no one could say. Some thought it wept for them. For the lives lived too short, the deaths too quiet, the firelight flickering over faces no one would remember. Others believed it was weeping for something far older, something the moon had once seen and couldn't forget. A wound in the sky, a silence too wide to ever speak again. The dogs lay flat that night, not whimpering, not growling, just listening. Eyes open, tails still. One of the hunters placed both hands on the earth, trying to feel if the sound had weight. He said later it didn't, that it wasn't touching the world, only passing over it, like the shadow of a bird too high to see, but close enough to chill the bones. The weeping continued through the night. It didn't grow louder, it didn't fade, just stayed, like it was waiting for someone to answer, but no one did. Because what do you say to the moon when it cries? What comfort can you offer to something that has watched the world since before the first flame? By morning, it was gone. The sound, the feeling, the strange heaviness in the air. The moon had already slipped beneath the hills, pale and silent, and the fire inside the cave seemed smaller than usual, as if it too had been humbled. No one spoke of it. Not that day, not the next, but when the moon rose again the following week, they all looked up and waited, just in case the sky still remembered what it felt like to grieve. And ever since, even now, there's a part of them that doesn't fully trust the moon's quiet, not because they fear it will harm them, but because they fear it hurts, and they know that kind of hurt never really leaves. It just watches, and waits, and weeps, when no one is listening. When the bones whispered different stories, they didn't bury the bones right away. Some they used, some they burned, some they left where they fell. Others, the ones they found curled near roots or half swallowed by earth, were studied in silence. Not with the eyes of scholars or sages, but with the quiet reverence of people who understood that stories don't always come from mouths. Sometimes, they come from what's left behind. Bones told truths. You could tell how something died, how it lived, how long it had wandered before the world took it back. If the joints were worn smooth, it had walked far. If the teeth were cracked, it had bitten something it shouldn't have. If the skull was wrong, shaped oddly, or split in places no blow should have landed, they knew to move on and sleep elsewhere. But once in a while, the bones didn't tell the story they were supposed to. They would find a skeleton, clean, whole, laid out neatly in a position that made sense. A curled body, hands near chest, knees to chest, the shape of someone sleeping. But the feeling would be wrong. The ribs would be too wide, the fingers too long. The neck twisted ever so slightly, as though it had once looked over a shoulder at something that never left. And the worst part, the marks, not cuts, not clawed, but worn. Like the bone had been held too tightly for too long, or like it had twisted slowly over time, not from pain, but from watching. They didn't like to speak near those bones. Even the children, curious as they were, kept a wide arc around them. They would draw near, peer for a moment, then move away, not because they were told to, but because the bones seemed to listen, as if they weren't finished yet. One evening, a group of hunters returned with a discovery, a cluster of bones buried beneath a collapsed tree. There were 4 sets, 3 small, 1 larger, arranged in a circle, with stones in their mouths. Each stone was smooth, rounded, the kind found only near the far river, but they had not been to the river, and the stones were warm. No one could explain it. They called for the eldest woman, who had once been a healer, a midwife, and something else no one named anymore. She sat with the bones for hours, didn't speak, didn't touch, just listened. When she finally stood, she said only this: they were trying to forget something. No one asked what, because in their hearts they already knew. Bones can lie still for centuries, but lies do not always sleep, and every so often, they rise through the marrow, not as screams or curses, but as something quieter, a contradiction. Another elder, a man with more memory than voice, once described a strange sound he heard while tending to old bones, a rustle, like wind through feathers. But he was indoors, alone, and when he leaned closer, he swore he heard breath. Not from himself, not from outside, from inside the skull. He left it there. The next morning, the skull was gone. The others didn't question it. They built a small pile of stones where it had been, and never stepped on that spot again. Some bones, they said, do not want to be named, do not want their story told, because maybe their story was never finished, and maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone when they died. There were stories of skeletons found twisted together in impossible ways, 3 femurs in a leg, ribs that grew into each other, hands with too many fingers, and always, no sign of struggle, just stillness, like they'd sat down calmly to become something else. And that was the fear, not what the bones told you, but when the bones disagreed, when one bone spoke of age, and another of youth, when the teeth belonged to one species, and the skull to another, when the stories buried in their shapes began to clash, that's when the tribe grew quiet. Because when bones start whispering different stories, something else is writing them, something that doesn't remember how it's supposed to end. Why no one looked at the hills after dusk? The hills were beautiful in the morning. Soft curves rising against the sky like old sleeping backs. Mist would collect in their folds and hang low in the early hours, and from a distance, it made them look like they floated, as if they were drifting slowly over the earth, only tethered by the roots of trees no one dared cut. In the light of day there was nothing to fear. Hunters walked near them, gatherers combed their base for berries and bark, children laughed in their shadows and threw stones from their ridges. The hills gave back silence, shade and nothing more. But when the sun began to sink, everything changed. No one was told to stop looking. There were no rules carved into wood or pressed into ash. It was simply known. By the time dusk came and the shadows lengthened, no one let their eyes rest on the hills. They looked to the fire, to the cave, to each other, never to the west. Not directly, not once the light had thinned and the sky turned to bruise. It wasn't just fear, it was instinct, old bone-deep caution that didn't need explaining. Even the dogs, restless and alert all day, would settle with their backs to the hills once night began. Their ears would twitch, their noses would quiver, but they would not turn, because something watched from up there. Not every night, not most nights, just sometimes, and sometimes was enough. One boy, long ago, had dared to stare, not to prove a point, not even out of curiosity. He had simply forgotten. The fire had held his gaze too long. The heat had made him drowsy. He had lifted his head to yawn, and his eyes had landed on the ridge, and something was there. He said it was standing, but not upright, not like a man. It was shaped like standing, like the idea of standing, but bent the wrong way, too long in some places, too narrow in others. No face, just direction. It didn't move, it didn't need to, because when he looked at it, he could feel it behind his teeth. The boy didn't scream, he didn't run, he simply lay down, faced the cave wall, and didn't speak again for 3 days. When he finally did, he only said, "It saw me seeing it." After that, the tribe was more careful. Even the youngest were taught how to avoid the hills without being told why. It was like learning to step around thorns or not drink from the river after a storm. You just knew. A few elders remembered a time before this habit, before the quiet rule took hold. They spoke of strange lights that sometimes blinked just above the ridgeline, not fire, not stars, but flickers, like eyes adjusting to new light. Others spoke of figures, not people, not beasts, who stood too still. Things that didn't walk, but changed locations anyway. Always seen only at the moment between day and dark, and never seen again. One hunter, older now, told of a shape he saw once in the grass near the base of the hill. At first he thought it was a rock, jagged, lumpy, with a hollow in the middle. But as the wind passed through the hollow, it made a sound. A voice without a voice. It didn't speak words. It didn't even sound human, but it had rhythm, intent, a kind of pull. He turned and left, didn't pick the mushrooms he'd come for, didn't gather firewood, just walked away and never returned. Others whispered of an older story, one never drawn on walls, never spoken at midday, a tale of something that lives in the hills, but not in a cave or a tree, something that uses the shape of the hill, as if the land were only its skin. It wakes only when watched. So they stopped watching. It wasn't fear that kept them from looking. It was memory. Because once you've seen something notice you, truly notice, you learn the difference between being safe and simply being unseen. And so every night, as the sun dipped and the fire cracked, they would turn their heads away, slowly, naturally, and pretend the hills were sleeping too. The markings that were already there, no one remembered making them. That was the first thing they agreed on. Even the oldest among them, the ones who still carried stories in their backs and knees. The markings had always been there, or at least they hadn't noticed them until they did. It was on the far wall of the sleeping chamber, the curved bit of stone no one ever leaned against, the one that felt just a little colder than the rest. For years it had gone untouched, not avoided, exactly just left alone. The kind of place that didn't ask for attention and quietly punished it when given. Then, one winter evening, while the fire crackled low and sleep came slowly, someone pointed, a child, half awake, eyes still soft with dreams. She didn't speak, just reached out and tapped the stone with a single curious finger. The others turned, and suddenly they were there. Lines, faint, pale, older than soot, older than blood, not quite carved, not quite painted, just present, as if the wall itself had remembered something and chosen this exact moment to show it. They weren't symbols, not like the kind they scratched to mark food or firewood. These lines didn't represent things. They suggested, they hinted, long curves, like ribs drawn by someone who didn't know what ribs were, spirals that almost touched and then pulled apart again, shapes that made the eyes follow but never find their end. The hunters swore they hadn't seen them the night before. The gatherers said they'd rested against that wall for years without noticing a thing. But now the lines were clear, not bright, not glowing, just unavoidable. One of the elders said nothing. He walked up to the wall and stared, not with fear, not with awe, just a quiet, solemn recognition. Then he sat down, rested his back against the markings, and closed his eyes. He didn't speak for the rest of the night. The next day he stayed in the cave, didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat there, back to the wall like a man waiting for something to return. By nightfall, he was gone. No sign of him, no blood, no footprints, just an indentation in the moss where his body had been, and one new line added to the markings, a short one, slightly curved, still damp. After that, no one touched the wall again, but the markings changed anyway, sometimes subtly, a curve thicker, a spiral just a little wider, sometimes suddenly, whole sections erased and redrawn overnight, never with sound, never with witness, but always noticed the next morning. They tried to cover it once, pounded old fur into the stone, pinned hides with bone pegs to block the shapes from sight. For a while it worked, then the coverings fell down, not torn, not pulled, just released, one peg at a time, until the wall breathed again. Eventually they stopped trying. Instead they made a circle of stones near it, not around it, but in front, not close enough to touch, but near enough to mark a boundary. The children were told not to play past the circle. The fire was never built too near. No one sat with their back to that wall anymore, not because it did anything, but because it could, and that was enough. The scariest part wasn't that no one made the markings, it was that the markings understood them. They changed with the seasons, grew more dense in winter, spread wider in spring. When someone died, the lines thinned out for days, only to return sharper than before. When someone was born, a small knot of shapes would appear in the corner, soft, smooth, like the shape of a name the child would never know. They didn't think it was evil, it didn't bring illness, it didn't curse the meat or sour the water, but it listened, and when you turned your back to it for too long, it responded. Some said the markings weren't drawings at all, but scars, that the stone remembered something long before people arrived, that it had been hurt, in some way only stone can be hurt, and the shapes were how it tried to speak. But the thing about speaking is, once you start, you expect someone to answer, and they never did, not aloud, because deep down they feared the markings might answer back, and no one wanted to know what the cave remembered when it finally decided to speak. The silence that followed the storm. The storm wasn't unusual. It came in the middle of the night, the way they sometimes did, without warning, without wind, just a sudden crack of light in the sky, followed by thunder that felt like it had crawled up from the ground itself. Everyone knew how to wait through it. They curled deeper into their furs, pulled children close, covered their ears, and listened to the familiar rhythm of the world, breaking apart and stitching itself back together in rain. The storm lasted for hours, long enough to make some wonder if it would ever stop. The flashes of light came quickly at first, then slower, deeper, as if the sky was growing tired of shouting. The thunder rolled in longer waves, then faded into steady rain. By the time the fire in the center of the cave had died to a quiet hiss, they could tell it was nearly over. But when the last drop fell, something strange happened. It didn't go back to normal. There were no bird sounds, no rustle of trees, no buzz of insects, not even the drip of water off stone. The air didn't smell like it should, after a storm. It had no sweetness, no earthiness, just stillness, as if the world had held its breath and forgotten how to exhale. One by one, the people stirred. A woman near the entrance stood up and listened. Nothing. A boy closer to the fire whispered to his brother. But even that whisper felt heavy. It was like sound itself was being swallowed, not silenced, taken. They stepped outside slowly, expecting to see trees bent from the wind or flooded trails. But instead everything looked untouched. No branches broken, no puddles too deep, not even footprints in the softened dirt. It was as though the storm had passed through without touching anything, except the sound. They waited. 1 minute. 2. A handful of them moved down the trail toward the woods, more out of habit than purpose, and still, nothing. No birds, no frogs, no wind. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt inhabited, like something had come with the storm and stayed behind after it left. Someone called out a name, a child who had gone missing the week before, not because they thought he would answer, but because it felt like the kind of moment when answers might arrive in the wrong voice. The name hung in the air longer than it should have, not echoed, suspended, as though even the stone was waiting to see what came next. When they returned to the cave, they didn't speak. They simply lay down, backs to the fire, and listened. Not to the storm, it was gone, but to the silence it had brought with it. And all through the next day, that silence held, not total, not deafening, just wrong. Even the tools made no sound against stone. The meat cooked without a sizzle, the water from the skin poured in one long soft hush. No one said it aloud, but everyone shared the same thought, that the world had lost something it had always had, and no one knew how to ask for it back. By the second night, it started to return. One bird call, far off, a breeze strong enough to shift the grass. The drip of moisture from a cave roof. It came back slowly, like a wounded thing testing the air, and after that, everything seemed normal again. But they never forgot how long the silence had lasted. They didn't talk about it much, not even weeks later when it became a story. They just gave it a shape in their minds. Not a storm, but the thing after the storm. Not the wind, not the rain, but the presence that followed when both had gone. And from that time forward, whenever thunder rolled in from the hills, they would listen carefully, not to the storm, but to what might be walking behind it. Why we left food for the things that didn't eat. No one said who started it. Maybe it had always been done, handed down not as a lesson, but as a reflex. The way you move slightly aside when walking alone in the forest, even when you don't see or hear anything, or the way your body knows not to look too long at the wrong kind of shadow. It wasn't a sacrifice, and it wasn't a gift. It was something quieter than either. Each night, after the main fire had burned down, but before the embers cooled completely, someone would place a small piece of food just beyond the cave's mouth. Not far, not hidden, just outside the ring of warmth. Sometimes it was a shred of meat, sometimes a few bitter berries, occasionally a cooked root, still warm and split down the middle, always enough to be recognized, never enough to be mistaken for generosity. No one ate it, no one claimed it. It would sit there, untouched through the night, and in the morning it would be gone. No crumbs, no drag marks, no paw prints or claw scratches in the dirt, just the flat, blank space where it had been, as if something had lifted it gently without bending the earth beneath it, as if the offering had been accepted without hunger, and that, they all agreed, was the point. Because the things it was left for didn't eat. Not really. They didn't need to. Or maybe they had forgotten how. Or maybe, and this was the thought no one liked saying out loud, maybe they remembered eating too well, and that's exactly why the food had to be left, not to feed, but to remind. There were stories, passed in fragments and half gestures, about the days before the offerings, about nights when something walked too close, when people vanished without sound, when a cave was found full of bones, all arranged carefully, as though each one had been weighed and placed for a reason. After that, the food began appearing, quietly, softly, without ceremony, and the disappearances stopped. One man once refused to leave it, said it was foolish, a waste of food they needed, that if a creature could come and go without being seen or heard, it wouldn't be stopped by a handful of roots, so he didn't leave any. He waited by the fire with his arms crossed, convinced he'd wake in the morning and laugh about the whole thing. He didn't wake. There was no struggle, no blood, just an impression in the dirt where he'd sat, and one bite taken from the root he had meant to eat himself. A clean bite. Not human, not animal, just wrong. After that, no one skipped a night. It became part of the rhythm of living. Wake, eat, work, watch the sun, listen to the trees, and before sleep, leave a little something at the edge of the dark. Some even began whispering a wordless sound while they did it. Not a prayer, not a plea, but more like a soft reminder. I remember you, because remembering seemed to matter. The things that didn't eat weren't like the wolves or the owls or the silent shapes in the trees. They didn't need territory. They didn't chase, they just watched, and occasionally reached. No one knew what they wanted. Maybe they wanted to be noticed, or maybe they hated being remembered. It was hard to tell, because they never answered directly. They answered through absence, not being seen, not being felt, not being heard when you walked out in the morning, and everything was still where you left it. That was how you knew the offering had been accepted. Nothing had changed, and when nothing changed, they were grateful. One elder suggested it wasn't food at all they wanted, but the gesture, the act of giving without asking. A small moment of humility in a world where everything was taken by force or fire. The offering wasn't for their stomachs, it was for their restraint. The things that didn't eat may have once been like them, or maybe they were always different. But they could still see, and sometimes that was all it took to be in danger, being seen too clearly by something that shouldn't be seeing you at all. So every night, they placed the food, and every morning, they thanked the nothing that had visited, the nothing that had left, because being left alone wasn't just luck, it was earned. The night the stars fell in the wrong place. They didn't have names for the stars, not the way we do. There were no constellations, no patterns passed down in stories about gods or animals. But they noticed, always. They watched, not for meaning but for rhythm. The stars came, night after night, and moved across the sky like herds no one could touch. Some bright, some shy, some steady enough to mark seasons by. The sky had a shape. Even if they didn't speak it, they knew it. And then, one night, the stars moved wrong. It wasn't dramatic. There was no crash or sound. No fire. Just a slow, quiet realization that the sky wasn't where it should be. At first, someone thought they were imagining it. The angle felt off. The line of light that usually arced gently across the horizon had a break in it. A sharp bend where there should have been a flow. One star too far left. Another lower than ever before. Not brighter, not closer, just misplaced. Others saw it too. The youngest boy in the group pointed and frowned, not with fear but confusion. A woman who always tracked the moon with pebbles shifted one from the usual row and blinked at it for too long. No one said it aloud yet, but they all felt it. Something was wrong above them, not just in the sky, in the rules. One of the elders stood and looked at the heavens for a long time. His mouth moved like he was trying to remember something from a dream he never finished. Then he sat back down and covered his eyes with both hands. That's when they knew it wasn't just unusual. It was dangerous, because the sky wasn't allowed to change. The world below was chaos, storms, hunger, the cold breath of predators waiting just beyond the fire. But the sky was constant. If the stars changed, it meant the one thing that never changed had decided to start. That night, they didn't sleep. Not one of them. They sat in silence, backs to the cave wall, eyes flicking to the sky, and then quickly away, like they were afraid the stars might catch them watching. A few whispered questions to each other, to no one, trying to understand what they were supposed to do. And sometime near dawn, one of the stars moved, not like the others, not drifting. It jerked, just a tiny motion, barely visible, a half step against the black, but it didn't twinkle, it didn't fade, it just adjusted, like it had noticed it was being watched and wanted to correct itself. Then another shifted, and another, until 3 stars far apart were now forming a line where none had been before. That was when the youngest child began to cry, not loudly, just a soft whimper, the kind that happens when something old inside you recognizes something it isn't meant to. The others didn't scold him. They understood, because when the stars change places, everything below them starts to feel loose, like the ground might forget how to hold you. When morning came, the sky brightened as usual, the sun rose, birds returned. Nothing seemed broken anymore. But the air had that weight, the kind that comes after something passes by without touching you but leaves its shape behind anyway. They looked up again that night. The stars had returned to normal, every one of them, where they should be, calm, predictable. But no one felt relieved, because if they could change once they could change again, and worse, they had chosen to go back, which meant something had watched them watching. From that night forward, they built the fire higher, not for warmth, not for cooking, but to keep the stars out of their eyes, because what scared them wasn't that the stars had moved, it was that something behind them might be able to move them back. What moved behind the firelight's edge? The fire was supposed to be the line, the border between what belonged and what didn't. It was more than heat, more than light. It was control, a circle of safety drawn in flame, where shadows stayed where they were told and the dark kept its distance. For most of their lives, it worked. The fire kept things out. It pushed back the world they couldn't see and gave shape to the one they could. But not everything obeyed. Sometimes, there was something just past the edge of the light. It never stepped fully in, never crossed the line, or made itself known in any real way, but it moved. Just barely, just enough to be noticed by the corner of an eye. A flicker, a shift, not a sound, not a shape, just wrongness, visible only in motion, and only when you weren't trying to look. At first, they told themselves it was wind, a branch, an animal too small to worry about. But wind didn't stop when you turned your head. Branches didn't lean closer, and small animals didn't freeze the air the way this did. They would sit around the fire, backs to the wall, faces lit orange and gold, and someone would pause. Their eyes would lift, just slightly, toward the outer ring of shadow. They wouldn't say anything. They wouldn't scream or even blink too hard. Just a quiet stillness, like their body had remembered something before their brain had caught up, and they would wait. That was the rule. You don't move, you don't speak, you just wait, because it didn't like being noticed. One boy made that mistake. He saw something, not clearly, just a shift of movement beyond the flames, and he leaned forward, just a bit, just enough to see if it was still there, and the fire hissed, not flared, not dimmed, it hissed, as if something between the boy and the dark had breathed, slow, shallow, and annoyed. He never did it again. That night, they moved the fire closer to the wall, a little tighter, a little smaller, not to be warmer, but to stay further from whatever watched from beyond, because the edge of firelight isn't a wall, it's a suggestion, and some things don't need permission. One woman, the oldest among them, claimed she once saw the firelight bend, not flicker, bend, like something had passed between the flame and the cave, and instead of casting a shadow, it swallowed the light whole. She didn't tell anyone until years later, but she still slept facing the stone, and when she died, the fire didn't burn right for 3 nights. They told stories to explain it, that something old had once lived just beyond reach, that it waited, even now, for someone to forget the fire's rules, that it wasn't hunting or haunting, just circling, not out of hunger, but out of memory. It had been there before people, before caves, before flame, and it remembered what the dark used to be. One night, they saw footprints in the ash near the fire, not boot prints, not paw prints, long, thin, deep, like something had stepped just close enough to taste the warmth, and then decided to leave before being seen. No one followed the tracks. They didn't even look too closely. They just added another log to the fire, widened the circle, and stayed up until sunrise. After that, they stopped using just one fire. They built 3, sometimes 4, in a loose circle, not for cooking, not for light, just to give the shadows less room to gather, because what frightened them wasn't what might come charging from the trees. It was what moved gently, patiently, just behind the firelight's edge, not hunting, not asking, just watching. When we stopped speaking one word, it was only one word, a small sound, really, just a brief shape made by the mouth, passed quietly from one person to another. It didn't mean danger, or fire, or food. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't sung. It was the kind of word that showed up only late at night, passed around low and close, when the flames had died down and everyone was too tired to pretend they didn't still feel afraid. No one remembered who said it first. Maybe it wasn't even invented, just found, like a stone smoothed by water, a sound that had always been there, waiting. And for a while they used it often, mostly in whispers. mostly when they wanted to speak about something they couldn't explain. It was a name of sorts, not of a person or place, but of a presence, something they all felt but couldn't draw, something old, something close. It was never said during the day. It wasn't forbidden, it just didn't belong to sunlight. You said it when the stars looked strange, when the wind changed mid-breath, when the bones didn't settle the way they should. You said it not to summon, but to acknowledge, as if saying it reminded the thing it named, that you knew it was there, that you hadn't forgotten, that you remembered the agreement. And maybe that was the mistake, because one night, someone said it too loudly, not screamed, not chanted, just too clear, too firm, a little too bold, like they didn't fear what might hear them, like they had gotten too comfortable with the way the world had been staying quiet. And that night, something changed. No one slept, not because of a sound, or a shape, or an attack. There was no howl from the woods, no movement near the firelight's edge, just a weight, thick and slow, like fog made of memory. The fire wouldn't catch, the stone floor felt soft, as though it no longer wanted to hold their weight, and most of all, the silence stared back. They didn't say the word again that night, not even to ask what had happened. The next morning, someone tried, just to see. They shaped their mouth around it, slowly, carefully. But when the sound came out, it felt wrong, not cursed, not painful, just misplaced, like trying to fit a tool into the wrong hand. The word was broken, or maybe they were. After that, it faded, not all at once, like a song slowly slipping out of tune. It stopped appearing in whispers, then in warnings, then in stories, until eventually, even the oldest among them wouldn't let it pass their lips. A few tried to write it in ash, or scratch it into stone, but the marks never lasted. The ash blew away too fast. The scratches healed overnight. And in the morning, the air near those carvings smelled like something deep had been disturbed. So they stopped, and not just out of fear, but respect, because whatever the word had named, it hadn't left. It had simply gotten tired of being spoken of too casually, like it was small, like it was known. And now that it was silent again, it seemed content to stay nearby, unseen, unmentioned, but felt, especially on the coldest nights, when even the fire didn't quite warm the room. When someone would glance toward the back of the cave without realizing, when the dreams turned too still, too quiet, that's when the word almost returned to their mouths. Almost, but they swallowed it, and let the silence have its space. It wasn't about what the word meant anymore. It was about who it reminded, and some things are better left unnamed once they've finally stopped answering. Why we buried stones like they were children. They didn't start by burying them. At first the stones were just found, small ones, smooth and warm, in places they shouldn't have been, tucked beneath sleeping firs, sitting in fire pits before the fire was lit, balanced in strange ways at the edges of trails no one remembered walking. They weren't threatening, they weren't sharp, but they made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. Some were perfectly round, some had faint grooves, as though something once held them too tightly. A few would hum, almost imperceptibly, like a thought you could nearly hear. The first one was discovered by a boy. He picked it up without thinking and carried it back to the cave, placing it beside the fire like a token. No one knew where it had come from. No one had seen that type of stone before, not in the hills, not in the rivers. It was from somewhere else, somewhere deeper. By morning, the firewood was damp, the flint wouldn't spark, the cave felt cold, even with breath rising in clouds. They moved the stone outside, and everything returned to normal. But the next day, there were 3 more. This time they buried them, not out of panic, not even fear, exactly, just a shared, unspoken instinct, as if the stones were meant to be underground. They didn't toss them or crush them. They dug small holes with flat sticks and hands, laid the stones gently into the earth, and covered them with quiet care, like you would a bird, or a memory. And they kept doing it, because the stones kept appearing, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, never where they were the day before, and always in places where they shouldn't be. Once, one was found nestled between the sleeping bodies of 2 sisters, perfectly centered, as though placed. Neither had felt it arrive. They said they'd had strange dreams, not nightmares, just too vivid, too detailed, and they woke feeling as though someone had borrowed their voices during the night and returned them slightly wrong. They buried that one deeper. Some began to treat the stones more carefully. They would speak to them under their breath as they carried them out to the earth. They wrapped a few in fur, even braided thin grasses around one like a cradle, not because they thought the stones were alive, but because they were beginning to suspect the stones remembered being held. One elder had a different theory. She believed the stones weren't arriving, they were returning, that they had once been part of something long before their time, something ancient and unfinished, and now they were trying to find their way back, piece by piece. But why show up in sleeping spaces? Why appear inside baskets and fires, and wrapped inside clothing? That was the part no one understood, until one night, a stone was found pulsing slightly, not glowing, not shaking, but breathing. A soft rise and fall, like the memory of a heartbeat. When they placed it into the earth, it went still again. And that's when they started treating them like children. Not as something helpless, but as something becoming. The stones weren't dangerous. Not yet, but they were waiting. Some even wondered if they were eggs, not of animals, not of anything they had words for, but of ideas, or presences, or forgotten voices looking for bodies. The burials grew more ritualistic. Little nests were dug. Quiet humming filled the air. Moss was laid down before the stones were covered. Some even whispered apologies as they placed the earth back over top, and over time, fewer stones arrived. Or perhaps they stopped noticing them. Maybe that was part of it too. Maybe the stones only came when you could see them, when you had room left to be unsettled, and once you learned to bury the unexplainable gently. The unexplainable didn't need to come as often, but still, every so often, a new stone would be found, and every time they buried it, carefully, slowly, like they were lowering something fragile back into the sleep it had accidentally awakened from. Not because it asked, but because somehow they understood it hadn't meant to arrive, not here, not yet. The day the river reflected nothing. The river was always a comfort, not safe exactly, but familiar. It fed them, washed them, reminded them of the seasons as they turned. It never ran dry. It never froze solid. It whispered in its own language, one they'd learned not to speak, but to live beside. The reflection was part of that rhythm. When you looked down, you saw the sky, the trees, the bend of your own face, even if you didn't understand what a reflection was. And then, one day, it was gone. No warning, no storm, no sign. The river still ran. The water was there, cold and quick, as always. But when they leaned over the bank, they saw nothing. Not darkness, not murk, just absence. The surface was flat, smooth as glass, but it gave nothing back. Not a shimmer, not a blur, not even light. At first they thought it was the angle of the sun, then they blamed the clouds. Someone stirred the water with a stick, expecting ripples. They came, but still, nothing looked back. You could place your hand into the water and see it vanish. Not below the surface, it just ceased to exist until you pulled it out again. It came back wet, cold, tingling. But the sensation that stayed longest was the sense that it had been noticed by something in the deep. They didn't fetch water that day. They didn't fish, either. Even the elders stayed clear. A few of the youngest didn't understand the danger and wandered close. Their parents pulled them back, not roughly, but fast, like they were avoiding a sudden drop that wasn't visible, only felt. Someone left an offering, a bit of meat on a flat stone, a small apology. A question, maybe. The river didn't take it. It just sat there, untouched, while the water rushed past on both sides. By nightfall the reflection still hadn't returned. One of the hunters suggested moving upstream. Maybe they could camp somewhere else for a few days. Let the river forget them. But the group stayed. Not out of courage, but from something heavier. The kind of waiting you do when you know you've already been seen, and moving would only look like guilt. That night, no one slept near the water. They lit the fires higher than usual. None of them faced the river. Not even the dogs. They sat with their backs to it, ears twitching, waiting for a sound that never came, because silence from the forest meant stillness. But silence from the river meant listening, and something was. By dawn, the reflection had returned. It came back slowly. First the light, then the trees, then the outline of one woman's cheek as she leaned close to check. But her eyes never showed, just her skin, flat and pale in the surface. It took another hour before the river reflected fully again. They never spoke about that day directly, but after that, certain rules changed. No one looked at the water too long. No one asked it questions aloud. And when they washed, they did it quickly, as if worried the river might remember the day it stopped giving anything back. Because the scariest part wasn't that the reflection vanished, it was that everything else stayed the same. The water still flowed, the sky still turned, but the connection, the silent agreement between surface and soul had broken for a while, and no one could say why. Some believed the river hadn't removed the reflection at all. They believed it had shown its true self, and in that moment, they were lucky it had shown them nothing, because something deeper than a mirror had looked back and decided not to answer. The sound that came from a cave with no end. They hadn't meant to find the cave. It wasn't on any path. It wasn't near water. It was tucked in, the kind of place people only reached by accident, or by being led. The hunters found it while tracking a wounded animal. The tracks had vanished into the rock, but what they found instead was a hollow in the hillside, wide and low, almost hidden by tall grass, and a scatter of bones too clean to belong to anything recent. At first, they thought it was nothing, just a shallow crack, a den, maybe. But when they dropped a stone inside to hear it bounce, it never landed, no clatter, no echo, just the soft suggestion of distance stretching out too far. Still, they marked it, out of habit, out of caution. And that night, the sound came. It wasn't a growl, or a whisper, or anything shaped by mouth, or lung. It was more like a memory of sound, a pressure in the chest, a note heard not with ears, but bones, low, steady, like something enormous, breathing through stone. No one could tell where it came from at first. The fire didn't flicker, the air didn't move, but the sound was present, not around them, but beneath them. A hum that lived in the floor, passing up through their heels and spines. One of the children began to cry, slow and silent, like they were remembering something they had never seen. In the morning, 2 of the hunters returned to the cave. They didn't go in. They stood just outside, listening. The sound wasn't there during the day. The entrance felt cold, but empty. No scent, no tracks. Just that strange dark mouth in the earth, open and still. They thought of sealing it, piling rocks, filling it in. But something stopped them. Not fear, not laziness, just the sense that the cave wouldn't accept it. So they left it alone. But the sound didn't. It came back the next night, and the one after, and always in the same way. Low, long, without pattern or end. Not rhythmic, but deliberate. Not a warning, but a presence. They started hearing it when they closed their eyes, not just near the fire, but in their sleep. It began slipping into their dreams, not as voices, not as visions, just the knowledge of a tunnel that didn't stop, winding forever downward, with no end, and no reason, only depth. Some said it was breathing, others said it was speaking in a language too old to shape words. One elder believed it wasn't sound at all, that it was the absence of sound, echoing back through time from a place where even noise had forgotten how to exist. A few brave ones went closer. They didn't enter, but they stood at the edge and shouted, just to see. They said their own names, then waited, and waited. No echo returned. The cave didn't speak back, not until nightfall. That evening, the sound changed, just slightly. It wasn't louder, it wasn't faster, but it had intention, a kind of pull behind it, as though something had heard its own name and wanted to remember who had spoken. That's when they stopped going near it, and soon they stopped talking about it. It wasn't forbidden, it just became too present, like speaking of it might wake it up, or worse, make it feel invited. So they circled it from far away. The grass grew tall again, the bones vanished, and the cave sat quiet during the day, waiting for the dark. They never blocked it, they never entered, because what terrified them wasn't that the cave was deep, it was that something at the bottom of it might one day decide to come up, and long before that happened, it had already begun to sing. When the ground gave back something we lost, it had been gone a long time. They had mourned it the way they mourned most things, not with ritual or words, but with a kind of heavy silence that settled over the group and took weeks to lift. A boy, young enough to still sleep closest to the fire, but old enough to wander on his own, had vanished one evening near the tree line. No sound, no cry, just a small figure trailing behind during a berry walk. And then, nothing. They searched, for hours at first, then days. The elders spoke of animal paths, of holes in the ground too small to see, of spirits that passed through without disturbing the grass. But the truth was no one knew, and eventually they stopped trying to know. The furs he slept in were folded, His name stopped being said. His place near the fire remained empty, not out of tradition, but because no one wanted to sit there, and the ground was quiet. For weeks the ground was just what it had always been, beneath them, around them, silent and hard. It held their footprints. It bore the weight of their fires. It accepted their dead, until one morning, it gave something back. Not loudly, not with thunder or quake, just a simple shift in the dirt at the edge of the trail near the southern tree, a slight mound that hadn't been there the night before. One of the women noticed it. She thought it was a burrow. She crouched, brushed the loose soil away with her hand, and found fabric, tattered, soft, the kind he used to wear. At first she froze, then she called the others, not with panic, not with hope, just with that low, urgent tone that meant something was wrong in a new way. They dug carefully, and beneath the soil they found everything. Not bones, not remains, not what the wild usually left behind, but his bundle of carved toys, a small leather string he used to fidget with, one sandal, a bit of red dye on crushed bark he used to mark stones, all of it packed together, not buried like trash, but placed, deliberately, gently, like the ground had been holding it in its hands. There was no explanation. It wasn't a grave. It wasn't near the spot he vanished from, and most of the items had never left the camp. They had disappeared with him. Now they were returned, cleaner than they should have been, preserved in ways they didn't understand. One of the elders said the ground had changed its mind. Another said it was warning them. They didn't find the boy, only the things he had touched most, the things that still remembered him. And that night, the fire burned unevenly, not weak, just unsettled, like the flame had forgotten its shape. After that, other things began to return. A lost flint knife, missing for a season, appeared on a stone near the river. A carved bone pendant, long thought stolen by an animal, was found neatly balanced on a fallen log. A fur wrap, soaked through and ruined months ago, appeared dry and whole at the edge of the sleeping space. But none of them felt like gifts. They felt like refusals, like the ground was slowly giving back what it didn't want to keep. Or maybe it had kept them too long, and they'd changed in the holding. One night, they unwrapped the toys again, not to use, just to look. And for a moment, one of them thought they saw a small print, too small for any adult, pressed into the clay bead, tied to the leather string. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't worn into the shape. It was pressed, fresh. After that, they buried the items again, not out of fear, not to hide them, but as a way of saying, "Thank you, we understand. You don't have to return anything else." Because sometimes when the earth gives something back, it's not an invitation, it's a warning. And the real question isn't why it returned those things, it's what else it's still holding, quiet, deep, and waiting to decide whether or not to let go. Why some names were never used twice. They didn't have many names, not the way we do, not a list chosen from books, or the echo of ancestors. A name was something earned slowly, like trust. It had to feel right on the tongue. It had to match the rhythm of the person's steps, or the shape of their eyes, or the kind of silences they kept. Most people were named only after their second winter, some not until after their third, and even then, the name could still change. It wasn't uncommon for a name to grow too tight, or too loud, or to fade into something else entirely. Names came and went like the seasons, but there were a few that no one ever said again, not once. Names that were only used once, then left to the dark. No one told the children why. They figured it out by listening, by noticing how some names brought silence to a room, how the air would slow when a certain sound was nearly spoken, a shiver down the spine that didn't come from cold, a fire crackle that grew too quiet, too fast. One of the names had belonged to a boy who vanished during a fog, not during a hunt, not during travel. He'd been standing beside his father one moment, helping split dried roots, and then he wasn't. No one heard a footstep, no one saw movement. He was simply gone, like the fog had been a hand that reached in and closed around him. They searched, of course, but not for long. The fog never lifted, and when it finally did, there was nothing. Not a mark, not a break in the earth, just the faint echo of his name, still hanging in the air like smoke that didn't want to leave. That was the last time anyone said it. Even his parents stopped, not out of pain, though that was part of it, but because something deeper told them the name had followed him, that it belonged now to whatever had taken him, and that saying it again might invite the same thing back. There were other names too, one that caused dogs to whimper when spoken, one that made flames lean sideways, even when there was no wind, one that no one could pronounce the same way twice, no matter how many times they tried. That one frightened the elders the most. Not because it was difficult, but because they suspected the name didn't want to be remembered correctly. A few brave ones tried to reclaim the names. Years later, after enough time had passed, they thought it would be safe. They gave one to a newborn girl. Soft, short, harmless. The name of a woman who had once danced at every fire. The girl didn't live through her second season. Not from illness, not from cold, just faded, quietly, like something had taken back what it thought was still its own. After that, the rule was unspoken, but absolute. If a name vanished with someone, it stayed gone. No carvings, no echoes, not even in dreams. When someone new was born, they waited longer to name them. They listened harder. They made sure the name was new, truly new, not borrowed, not reassembled, not even similar to the ones they had buried in silence. Because they'd come to believe names had weight, real weight, like stones carried through generations. And if you picked up the wrong one, you might carry something you weren't meant to, or worse, something might come looking for it. So they guarded the forgotten names, not with fear, but with distance. They didn't erase them, they just let them sink into the earth, one syllable at a time. And when the wind said something that almost sounded familiar, they turned away and busied their hands. Not because they didn't remember, but because they remembered too well. And the thing about names is, they remember you back. The place we dreamed before we knew sleep. Long before they had words for dream, they still wandered through them. Before sleep meant rest, before it meant escape, before it came wrapped in night. There was something else, something older. A place the mind went that had no shape, no sound, and no direction, but one they all somehow recognized. Even the youngest would sometimes wake in the night, with wide eyes, not afraid, not crying, just quiet, listening for something that hadn't spoken aloud, but still echoed behind their ribs. The others would nod softly, and let them stay close to the fire, because they knew the feeling. They had been to that place too, and they knew it was not a place sleep took you. It was a place that came to you when it wanted. They never built near the grove with the hollow stone, not because it was cursed or forbidden, no one ever said that, but because too many had walked there in their dreams before they knew the grove even existed. They would describe it afterward, each time in the same way, the stone in the center, the ring of trees that moved in a wind you couldn't feel, and that strange pressure behind the eyes, not pain, not fear, just a sense that you'd been there before, always before. Some believed it was where the mind went before it learned to make stories, a sort of waiting room inside the world. Others thought it was the shape the world made when no one was watching it, the dream the earth itself whispered, long before humans began to listen. And sometimes, even during waking, the dream place tried to return, in firelight that blinked the wrong way, in a patch of moss that felt too warm, in a sound, soft, low, like memory made of fog. One of the elders, near the end of her days, described it best. She said, "It's the place we were meant to be from, but we came out of it too early." She claimed it had no floor, no ceiling, only a curve that you moved through sideways. That time didn't happen there, not forward or backward, but in small spirals, the way water turns in a bowl when stirred gently. Others nodded. They didn't understand the words, but the feeling was familiar. Some had stopped speaking of it altogether, not out of fear, but reverence, because trying to explain that place made it go quiet for a while, and no one wanted to lose it. For all its strangeness, it felt like home, more home than the cave, more home than the body, more home than the name you carried, or the people you knew. It was the first place, before sound, before breath, before even the dark had shape. The dream place had been there, waiting, not patient, not kind, just present, like the stone under your feet, like the sky behind your closed eyes, and every so often, it would reach out again, not with words, but with a pull, a memory of light you hadn't seen, a warmth that didn't come from fire, a figure standing in a field that had never grown in your world, but one you'd always somehow known. The children understood it best. They spoke of it freely, until the dreams became rare, and the language grew louder in their heads. Then they, too, fell quiet about it. But in those earliest years, before full sleep took hold, in that drifting space between awareness and something deeper, they smiled at nothing, and whispered things that didn't come from stories, because before they knew sleep, they remembered where they had been, and some part of them still wanted to go back. When the rain remembered something old, rain was never feared, not at first. It was life. It meant roots would deepen, food would grow, it filled their carved bowls and hollow stones. It brought coolness after heat, sound after silence. The rhythm of it was familiar, something even the oldest among them still smiled to hear. Babies quieted at its touch. The fire softened its voice when rain was near. It was, for most of their lives, the closest thing they had to comfort, until the day the rain came down wrong. It didn't fall harder or faster. It wasn't black or hot or strange in smell. It looked like rain. It sounded like rain. But something had changed, not in the sky, but in the feeling behind it. The kind of shift that made people stop speaking mid-sentence and slowly turn their faces upward, not in joy, but in recognition, because the rain had remembered something, and they didn't know what. It began with the way the drops hit the ground. They didn't scatter, they sank. Directly, immediately, as if the soil had been waiting, thirsty not for water, but for contact. Then came the wind, not forward or sideways, but downward, like a breath being held too long, finally exhaled into the bones of the land. Some of them wept, but didn't know why. One elder said she felt like she was being watched from underneath, as if the earth had rolled its eyes upward for the first time in 1,000 years, and rain was the signal that had woken it. The caves grew damp in places that had never leaked. The fire hissed in the wrong rhythm. The air in the back of the shelter changed, not colder, just older. And then the humming began, not from mouths, not from throats, from the ground, from the stones outside, from the trees, a low, near-silent tone that rose only when no one was speaking, a sound that felt like it had always been there, waiting for the rain to remember the words. The children stopped playing, not from fear, but stillness, as if listening for something just beyond the reach of sound. And the elders, they stayed quiet, not confused, not panicked, just remembering, because deep down, a few of them had heard this before, a long time ago, before speech, before story, back when memory was still shared like fire, passed from hand to hand without shape, without name. It had happened once before, they said, maybe longer ago than time itself. The sky had opened in the same way. The rain had fallen in straight, thoughtful lines, and something beneath the earth had stirred, not in anger, but in response. The rain had spoken first, and the ground had answered. No one knew what it meant, only that after the last time, things were different. A species vanished, a mountain cracked, the stars shifted in their pattern, something agreed to something else, and the world had held its breath ever since. Now it was happening again. The rain slowed after the third day, but the feeling stayed, like something forgotten had been remembered too clearly, and now it was trying to fit back into the present. They didn't know whether to welcome it or beg it to forget again. One of the old hunters walked out into the open and let the final drops hit his skin. He stood for a long time, head bowed, not in worship, but in apology. When he returned, he whispered, "It knows we're still here." No one asked what he meant. They just listened to the last few raindrops fade into the soil, and for a long time after, even on clear days, the world still smelled like something that wasn't quite done raining. Because sometimes, rain doesn't just fall, sometimes, it remembers, and what it remembers doesn't always want to stay forgotten. The fear that had no shape, only timing. There were dangers they could name, claws, teeth, hunger, the cold, the silence after a distant scream. These were known things, felt in the body and remembered in the bones. You could point to them, prepare for them, tell stories about how to avoid them. But this was something different. This wasn't a thing you saw, it was something you felt, always just before something else. A shift, a breath, a pause. Not during danger, but before it, long before it, hours, sometimes days. It crept in like a fog, with no scent, no chill, just a timing that always proved itself too late to help, but too exact to forget. They didn't have a word for it, but they all knew when it had arrived. The fire would burn a little too quietly. The air in the cave would grow heavier, not colder. Food didn't taste spoiled, but different, like it had been seasoned with memory instead of salt. People spoke less, but not from tiredness. They simply didn't want to hear their own voices echo back at them. And always, something followed. A fall, a death, a disappearance, a broken bone. Sometimes small, sometimes not. Sometimes something that could be explained. Other times, not at all. But the fear always came first. That's what made it worse. It wasn't reactive. It was early. It didn't show itself when the danger appeared. It arrived when nothing was wrong, when everything seemed quiet, seemed normal, seemed safe. But deep inside, a part of you knew that the rhythm had already changed. It happened one season, like clockwork, just after the third full moon. They were preparing to move camp, not far, just a shift downhill. The day was warm, the sky calm, but no one laughed, no one sang. Even the youngest among them stayed close to the fire, chewing without looking up. No one said it, but they all felt it. The timing was wrong, and by nightfall, the storm arrived. One they hadn't seen coming. Rain like teeth, wind like it was searching for something. They survived, but barely. A few shelters were lost. A woman vanished between tents, not dragged, not taken, just gone, mid-step, with no sound, no struggle, no trace. And someone finally said it aloud. I felt it this morning. No one needed him to explain what it was, because they'd felt it too. They always did, and once it passed, you could almost forget. Until the next time you sat in silence and noticed that everyone else was doing the same, as if they were waiting for a sound that hadn't happened yet. The fear had no face, no sound, no direction, only timing. It always came just early enough to be useless, but just late enough to make you wonder if it had been warning you after all. Some believed it wasn't fear itself, but a visitor, something that walked alongside time, not in it. Something that couldn't stop the bad things, but needed you to feel them coming, like a courtesy, or a promise. Or maybe a game. Some tried to trick it, to break the rhythm, stay awake through the night, change routines, delay the hunt, but it didn't matter. The fear came anyway, right on time. That's what made it worse than any beast. You couldn't fight it, you couldn't see it, and worst of all, you could always tell when it had arrived, not because of what it brought, but because of what it changed. And once it settled in your chest, there was no way to shake it loose until it had finished what it came to do. Why the trees were counted every moon? They didn't always count them. At first, the trees were just part of the world. Shelter, shade, warmth in the cold seasons. Markers to guide the paths. No one thought to count them. There was no reason to. A tree was a tree, solid and certain. The forest didn't change overnight. Until it did, no one noticed right away. It began with a child saying there was a tree outside the cave that hadn't been there the day before. The others dismissed it. Kids say things. Maybe he hadn't looked closely before. But that night, another hunter mentioned the same thing. A particular birch near the bend in the trail. Smooth, pale, leaning just slightly east. It hadn't been there. Now it was. They went to look. It stood there, exactly as described. Roots too clean. No moss, no markings. Not even bird droppings or broken branches. Like it had just arrived. Still, they let it be. Until it happened again. A new tree. This one taller, thicker bark. No seedlings near it. No fallen leaves. Just standing there like it had always been. And everyone somehow knew it hadn't. The elders said nothing for a time. But that night, one of them walked the perimeter and placed stones around the base of each tree near the camp. Just small ones. Just to be sure. A few days later, there was a tree with no stone. That was when they began to count. Every moon, just after it rose full into the sky, a small group would walk the edge of the forest. Quiet, careful. They didn't speak the numbers aloud, only marked each trunk with a touch of ash or bark scratch. By morning, they would tally the count and compare it to the last. Sometimes it was the same, but sometimes it wasn't. Not trees being cut or blown down. Not trees growing, but new trees, ones no one remembered planting, passing, or stepping over. Trees that hadn't aged a day, but stood among the others like they'd always belonged. There was never more than one or two at a time, never enough to alarm the children. But the adults knew something was changing in the woods, and it didn't feel like nature. It felt like placement, like someone, or something, was adding. No one dared ask why, but they did begin to notice things. Some of the new trees didn't cast shadows. One was found weeping sap that smelled like rotting flowers, though no insects came near. Another appeared, directly in the middle of a fire pit they had used the night before. No burn marks on its bark, no damage. Just standing there, untouched, and completely still. One elder believed they weren't trees at all, that they were sentries, or warnings, or watchers. "They're not growing," she whispered once. "They're remembering." From that night on, they counted more carefully. They stopped using chalk or marks that could be washed away. They carved deep notches into bark. They made maps in ash, and still, the trees changed. Sometimes one of the notched ones would be gone. No stump, no roots, just space. And a new tree, somewhere else. Perfect and blank. Eventually they marked the trees they trusted. The ones that had always been there. Old, twisted, familiar. The rest, they left alone. Because the numbers had started to shift in a pattern. Always on the full moon. Always increasing by one. And no matter how far they walked into the woods, the pattern followed. They never said what they feared would happen when the numbers reached a certain point. But they all had the same silent question. What happens when the trees outnumber us, and know it? The first shadow that didn't belong to anyone. They had always known what shadows were, even before they had words for light and shape. They understood shadows. They danced when fire did. They moved when you moved. They stretched long at sunset, huddled close at noon. Children chased them, waved at them, laughed when they waved back. Shadows were a part of you, extensions of breath, body-made ghosts that did nothing unless you did. So when the first one showed up alone, it was noticed immediately. It didn't belong to anyone. There was no figure beside it, no movement that explained it. Just a long, thin shape cast along the rock wall one late afternoon, steady in its outline, perfectly still, while no one stood in front of the light. At first they thought someone was playing a trick. The hunters checked the angles, looked for a tree, a tool, a person out of sight. But there was nothing. The fire crackled low and soft, the rock glowed warm with fading sun, and the shadow stayed, still, clear, patient. It didn't shift with the fire, it didn't shrink when the light changed. It simply remained. One of the younger ones stepped near it, slowly, just close enough to cast his own shadow alongside it, and that's when they noticed something worse. The new shadow moved away, not the boy, the original one, as if it didn't want to be touched, as if it had chosen its place. The elders said nothing that night, but the fire was kept burning longer than usual. No one sat with their backs to the rock wall, and before sleep, they all took turns glancing toward the place where the shadow had first been. It was gone, but only because the light had faded. The next morning, they marked the spot with ochre, a ring, a memory, and for a while things were calm, until the shadow came back. This time, it was in a different place, near the cooking stones. Same shape, same stillness, same refusal to belong to anyone. It hovered just on the edge of awareness, visible if you looked directly at it, but clearer somehow in the corner of your eye. They started calling it the first, not in words exactly, but in the way their eyes moved when someone said shadow, and the others immediately knew which one they meant. Because now there were more. It didn't happen all at once. But slowly, other shadows began to appear where none should be. Beneath the fire, where no shadow should live. Curled in the corner of a tent, unmoving even when the fabric shifted in the wind. Cast across the ceiling of a cave, with nothing below to make it. And none of them matched anything. Not a shape, not a person, not even logic. Worse still, these new shadows began to react. When someone approached, they would still. When someone passed quickly, they'd stretch just slightly, like reaching or listening. One woman swore hers followed her home. Not her real one, the one that moved with her hands and danced at her feet. The other one, the one that had appeared at the edge of the sleeping ground, just for a moment, and then didn't disappear when she moved away. That night, she claimed it was waiting for her beside her bed of fur and straw. No shape, no face, just a long patch of dark that wasn't hers. After that, they began keeping closer to the fires, not for warmth, but to stay seen. Because if a shadow needed a person to exist, then something was bending the rules now, and it didn't seem interested in giving them back. Some of the oldest among them whispered that the first shadow wasn't new, that it had been waiting. That light was the intruder, and shadow was the memory of before fire, before sun, before eyes had learned to see, and now it had remembered itself, and it wanted to walk, not with them, not beside them, but in place of them. By the end of the season, no one stood near the cave wall after dusk, no one cooked alone, and no one, no matter how brave, ever tried to step inside a shadow that wasn't theirs, because they'd learned the most important thing. You cast a shadow because you're real. But sometimes, the shadow comes first, and it waits for something to fill it. Why we feared ourselves most of all. In the end, it wasn't the teeth in the forest, not the sounds at night, not the fire that flickered backward, not the dreams that remembered too much. It was us. That was the quiet truth. The elders never said aloud, but one everyone somehow knew. Beneath the stories, the rituals, the counting, the watching, there was a silence that never changed, and it had nothing to do with the things outside the circle of firelight. It had everything to do with the ones sitting just beyond it, the ones who looked like us, because no matter how many shadows we chased, the strangest ones still came from our own hands. They had no language for betrayal, no word for madness, no name for the moment when the mind turned inward and made something sharp, but they saw it, and once seen, it couldn't be forgotten. A child who returned from the woods with a different voice, a mother who watched the fire too long and laughed at nothing, a hunter who woke up one morning and didn't recognize the cave, the tribe, or the name he had been given since birth. They weren't possessed, they weren't cursed, they were changing, but not from the outside. They were folding inward, losing something, or perhaps gaining something no one should have. And that was the worst part, because it meant the danger wasn't in the trees, it was in us. They tried to explain it the only way they knew how, by separating. Those who changed were moved to a distant ring of stones where they could sleep alone under the stars, not in punishment, not even fear, just distance, a chance to forget what had been glimpsed. But some returned, and they were quiet and too kind. Their voices smooth, their steps too even. They smiled too long, remembered things that never happened, and one by one the others realized. The real fear wasn't being taken, it was being left behind in your own skin, still breathing, still speaking, but no longer certain if you were you. They began drawing lines in the dirt at night, not to keep animals out, but to keep people in, not for safety, for certainty. Because the moment we started fearing ourselves, we stopped trusting what our eyes told us. Was that your brother across the fire, or something wearing his shape? Did you feel that shift in your chest because of the wind, or because you knew deep down that the thought you just had wasn't yours? That's why they whispered, even in safety. That's why they buried the names that made their mouths feel strange. That's why no one liked being the last one awake, because they feared the moment when your own voice would sound unfamiliar, when your shadow would hesitate, when the words in your head would feel too clever to be your own. And it had nothing to do with monsters. It had everything to do with the secret everyone carries, that there's a door inside each of us, a very old door, and no one remembers locking it. We feared the sky, the ground, the trees, the whispers that didn't match the wind, but in the end, we feared most of all the moment we'd look inside ourselves and find someone already staring back. Thank you for walking through the dark with them. If you've stayed with this story until now, thank you. This has been what cavemen actually feared more than wild beasts. You've just finished the final part. Be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? We'd love to know who's watching, and who might be watching with you. Sleep gently, or not. We'll be here.